Hi, everybody. Welcome to Kindred Skulls. I'm Matt Fries, here with my co-host, Nick Olson. Nick, how are we doing today?
Oh, I'm doing great, man. It literally was just announced Patrick Peterson coming back to the Vikings on a cheap one-year, $4 million contract. That, on top of all the other news we got this week, a right guard, a nickel cornerback, Za'Darius Smith's contract came out. Turns out he's only on the cap right now for $3.3 million. Crazy big news. A lot of encouraging stuff this news this week. Team's really starting to come together. So Pat Pete back, though, plugs a huge hole. Previously, we had Chris Boyd out there starting as a boundary corner. Now Patrick Peterson steps in. We can just dive right into it. I thought he had a phenomenal year last year. I think he really went underrated by a lot of guys just because he didn't really get targeted so much. And part of that was Bashad Breeland and Mackenzie Alexander had like kind of down years and got picked on a lot. But you go back and you watch the All-22 and Patrick Peterson wasn't getting picked on because for the most part, he was very sticky in coverage. He had some, some moments where his declining agility showed, like that touchdown he gave up to DeAndre Hopkins against the Cardinals, where he lost Hopkins in the end zone. Like, yeah, he's no longer like, able to that was like a broken play where Kyler
that play was such a tough ask for a corner. That's such a hard play to ask literally anybody to cover, especially DeAndre Hopkins for that long. So
he's not the all-pro that he once was, who could have probably kept up with Hopkins back in the day, but he's still a solid number one cornerback, I think, in the NFL. His run defense isn't phenomenal. He's probably makes some business decisions, I think, in the run game. It's probably fair to say at this point. But he's fine in run defense, and he's, I think, legitimately above average still in coverage. The physical traits are no longer elite. They're probably just NFL average, I would say. Maybe even arguably below average for his agility, at least. His long speed's still fine, but his agility has declined. But as a boundary corner, you can get by with that, especially when you have the instincts. And man, he reads wide receivers and stays in phase with them so well. So he's able to read the hips, and he'll step with them step for step. So if they sort of shuffle step outside, he'll shuffle step outside. And if they do a stutter go, or do a comeback double move go, he'll shuffle his hips down, throttle down to the comeback, and then sprint up and stay on top of them as they do on the double move. So he doesn't get fooled very, very well. And I think he's a great fit for what the Vikings want to do on defense, where he can probably play a little bit more off coverage. So his lack of speed doesn't get exposed as much, but you can put those instincts to use. So I think he's a really good player. Really excited to have him come back, and I think for the price tag of $4 million, I think you're going to be hard pressed to find anybody who doesn't see the value there. So, what do you think, Pat Pete? Back to the Vikings.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm all in on this. This was something we talked about previously as somebody I'd like to bring back to the team. There were other options out there in free agency of players who had worked in the Fangio system before. I would have also been fine with them, but I think you kind of covered it. I know his PFF grade last year wasn't great, right? Like, I think it was honestly below average, but I think that honestly belies the level that he played at last year. I thought he was a quality starting corner in the NFL, right? Like you said, he's not playing at an all-pro level, but he played at a very quality level, and we didn't have a whole lot of good corner play last year. So I think watching him in comparison, he looks really good in our scheme, in Mike Zimmer's scheme. And I think that carries over to the Fangio scheme, right? We talked a couple weeks ago on the Fangio scheme, maybe a month ago at this point, about how many of the zone coverages, how much of pattern matching, or reading what's in front of you and passing it off. And to your point, like you said earlier, that's going to be in his advantage. Maybe he's not somebody who you want to, be playing man coverage 100% of the time, right? So like sometimes in those situations you get what's called MEG, right? Man everywhere he goes coverage. That's pure man coverage. Maybe that's not something you want to be asking him to do, and that's something a boundary corner can be asked to do a lot in those situations. Against speedsters who are trying to run across the field on vertical over routes, he's probably not going to be able to keep up with those just because he doesn't have the elite speed that he used to have. Like you said, it's not necessarily a problem, right? There are corners who get by for a very long time without having that elite speed, who become very good without having that elite speed. And I think Patrick Peterson, with the savvy in his game, is kind of at that point right now where he can still play at a high level despite lacking maybe the elite physical traits that he came into the league with and that he dominated with for so long. So he really has turned into a player who, despite declining physical traits, which can be the downfall for, and cornerback is such a difficult position to play on defense. Like, that athleticism is such a key part of it for a lot of players. You really need to get by. You really need to be a very savvy player if you're going to get by without having that elite athleticism. And I think Peterson has turned into that. So no, totally agreed there. I really like the signing. I think it gives us and we'll talk about the other two corners we signed later. It gives us a acceptable corner room, assuming we make an addition through the draft, I think is kind of where I'm at on it. Right. Yeah. So we still kind of, I think, need to add a little bit more, but it's at least palatable. Whereas previously, like, to be honest with you, before the Pat Pete signing, I would have thought we needed to add 2 startable corners, 2 players who can start on this defense, right? And that's not necessarily saying that they will start, but you know, you need to have that stable over rotation. I think at least 4 guys deep to be able to keep guys fresh, or if guys, you know, tweak something a little bit, you know. And Pat Pete missed 3 games last year, right? Like, he injured his hammy on a vertical ball, right? He was exerting himself pretty heavily on that play, and I think that's why he got injured it was, I remember the play it happened, it was against Carolina on a vertical route, right? So, you know, with an older player, we talked about his declining physical traits, you know, that is somewhat of a concern for me, injuries moving forward, just from him having to strain himself in some situations. So, you know, at the end of the day, I love the signing. We still need to do a bit more at the corner position. We'll get to that a little bit later, but I think it's a great fit in the defense that we have as well.
Yeah, and 2 things that I just want to sort of emphasize before we move on from Pat Pete is I like the fit last year with Zimmer, especially compared to what he was doing in the Cardinals, where the Cardinals 2020 ran so much cover 1, and they even asked Patrick Peterson to move into the slot. Pat Pete gave up 5 touchdowns in 2020. People thought he was cooked. 4 of those were from the slot, though, where he had to cover like Terry McLaurin, Stephon Diggs, covered a lot of like quick, speedy guys, and that's not his game anymore. But you put him on the boundary exclusively, he's still a very good boundary corner. He's still big, he's still physical. He's still really able to smother tops of routes. So in this Corda system, you know, I'm fine with Patrick Peterson, you know, being in press man coverage on guys. And it's but what the Corda system does so well is it gives you the 2 safeties inside, so that, you know, a lot of times you can pass off routes that you know, go inside, and Patrick Peterson isn't forced to carry guys running over routes and across the entire field, because he's probably not going to be able to keep up with the speedsters of the NFL anymore on those over routes. So those would be really, really hard for him to defend in like a cover 1 system. But I think it's becoming clear, despite how much cover 1 Donatel ran last year, that this isn't going to be, we don't have the horses in the barn to run cover 1, you know, as our you know, predominant coverage shot concept. So the split safety coverages are going to help him. The other thing is Patrick Peterson is really, really good for the first 3 seconds in coverage, and it's when quarterbacks are able to extend plays the way that Kyler did, or Russ did, or, you know, some of these other quarterbacks did last year. That's when Patrick Peterson can get in trouble, because that's when your lack of quickness and some, you know, the declining, I still think it's fine, but the declining long speed comes into play as well. But when you have Za'Darius Smith and Danielle Hunter up front getting pressure, that completely changes the game, because then Patrick Peterson can really, he can jump routes, he stays so well in phase for the first few seconds, and the only place where he gets exposed is if he's like in the slot and he's after covering guys who are doing double moves or something. I think DK Metcalf got him on a double move once, so those can be a little tricky for him. Or when, you know, the quarterback is holding on to the ball really long. I don't think you're going to see that as much this year, both because of the scheme, but also because of the pass rushers they've added up front. So I think it's just kind of like, this is the exact sort of boundary cornerback that we needed to sign. So makes that, I think, a big difference going from Chris Boyd to a former All-Pro. So yeah, I love to see it, especially at the price point.
Yeah, so that last point you made, just to re-emphasize it, is a really good one, because, and we've harped about this on this podcast, right? If you cannot get pressure, like you're cooked on the back end. Like corners can't cover for 5 seconds. It's just physically impossible for them, right? Like it's hard enough to cover for 3 seconds. It's hard enough to cover that initial amount. But if you can't rush with 4, you just kind of don't really have a chance as a defense. And that was kind of the situation we were in last year towards the end of the season because our guys could not get pressure on that. Speaking of that ability to get pressure, you mentioned him, Za'Darius Smith. His contract details have been announced. Last time, we knew it was a 3-year, $42 million deal, but we did not know the details, which are extremely favorable for the Vikings. One of the key pieces of the contract is in each of the 3 seasons, but specifically key for this season is that he has a $3 million per game roster bonuses. $3 million in per game roster bonuses. So divide 3 million by 17. Every game he is on the active 46 man roster, he would get whatever that number is per game. The thing that matters here, and this is kind of a cap detail thing, is that this is a not likely to be earned incentive for 16 of the 17 games for him. This season because he missed almost all of last season. He only played in the Saints game, the first game of the season for the Packers last year. So because those are classified as not likely to be earned incentives, almost $3 million, right? Like divided by 117, subtract that, but almost $3 million of what he's going to earn this year if he plays all 17 games does not count against the cap for the Vikings. So that's critical in a season where the Vikings were very close up against the cap and kind of had to strain to make these moves to fit themselves in under the cap. We saw a bunch of extensions. We saw a bunch of salary cap reductions, that sort of thing. And this is a part of that. So, Za'Darius Smith, $3.3 million. The deal also is functionally only a 2-year deal. I believe his cap hit for next season is $11 million. Or $12 million. That'll go up because if he plays all the games, then that money gets added to next season's cap, but that's not too big of a deal. The final season of the deal is about $20 million, and he is literally never going to see that because it's unless he is a dominant defensive player of the year candidate for 2 seasons in a row, then yes, absolutely we'll keep him on that money. But I don't quite think that's going to be where he's at this point in his career. Not to say he's not going to be a good player, but yeah. So I rambled a bit there, but any more thoughts on the Za'Darius Smith contract?
Yeah, the 2 things that make it extremely player friendly is, when they initially announced for 3 years, $42 million, it sounded like, okay, yeah, I mean, Za'Darius Smith, for, like a edge 2 kind of contract, that makes sense. Like, yeah, he's worth that. But then it came out that there's this last year, it's a 3-year deal, that the last year is basically a dummy year. They stuffed it full of $15 million of salary, 14.45, plus a $2.5 million roster bonus. Basically, it's $20 million in dummy money that there's no chance he sees any of that. So it's really more like a 2-year, $22 million contract. And if things go very poorly, it's basically like a vet minimum contract with a $5 million signing bonus. So they can get out of this very, very easily. If Za'Darius, things go terribly wrong and he misses every game, they're out very, very little money. So basically all the risk goes with the player on this one. The other thing that makes it very player friendly is they have extremely high per game roster bonuses for this. As he mentions, $3 million each year. So usually those only go up to, $500,000 is normal. $1 million is high. $2 million is pretty rare. $3 million, I'm not sure I've seen that before. So extremely high, kind of signals that his health is a big part of this contract, I think. One little lesser known fact that I actually only recently found out about is that so his per game roster bonuses this year are considered not likely to be earned. However, when he plays them, when he suits up, if he plays 17 games, then those cap hits, what is it, like $1.7 million every game or $170,000 for every game he suits up, that will count against the cap for this year. It won't fall to next year. So those cap hits become chargeable in the year they're earned, even though they are not likely to be earned.
Okay.
So yeah. So if Za'Darius Smith, the Vikings have to basically have $6 million of cap room on hand, because if he does play every game, and hopefully he does, he will finish the season with a $6 million cap hit, even though right now he's only at a $3.3 million cap hit. So that keep that in mind, I guess, when you're thinking about all the other cap space the Vikings need for the draft, for the 53-man roster, for the practice squad, for midseason signings, because while it is technically on the books for $3.3 million, it probably will functionally end up a lot closer to $6 million. Hopefully it does, because it means he'll have played every game. And then there's some sack escalators as well. Overall, though, if he lives up to the upside in this contract, it's a slam dunk for the Vikings. Best case scenario, he plays 17 games and they get him next year for a $14 million cap hit, but he's returned to his All-Pro, caliber of performance.
Yep.
Worst case scenario, the Vikings took a swing and are basically out, $5 million, $7 million of dead money, which is very little to sign a Pro Bowl caliber player and have it blow up in your face and be able to walk away from it with so much flexibility. So, they could move on from him next year and still save a lot of money if things don't work out. But if they do work out, the Vikings have like a very cheap contract. So it's an incredibly player-friendly, team-friendly contract from a lot of different angles. Was some really impressive cap work from Kwesi and Rob Brzezinski. So awesome stuff to see.
Yeah, there was a little bit more cap work that we got information on. Adam Thielen's contract details were announced today as well. They're up on Over the Cap. It turns out he did not actually take a pay cut. I believe he actually got about $2.5 million more in terms of money in that deal, and he got more guaranteed money, or really he got a signing bonus conversion, and then he got a day where money guarantees next season. So he will have very significant cap hits in 2023 or in 2024, 19 and $21 million. And then they added a void year onto the deal. And that was the reason they needed to renegotiate in the first place, was for that void year, which helps extend, the signing bonus conversion that they did out an extra year, and saves essentially, it probably saved about $2 million off the cap once you turn 4 years into 3 years and stuff like that. But so at the end of the day, Thielen, still a Viking, probably going to remain a Viking. You would take on a $13 million dead cap charge in 2023 if you cut him, which is a lot. You would still save money at that point, but it's still a lot of money to move on from somebody like that. So I expect him to remain on the Vikings for the foreseeable future. Just wanted to get that out of the way. We can move on to Jesse Davis, if you want, who also had void year shenanigans, I guess. He had a 1 year, $3 million deal. I believe $1.5 million of that was a signing bonus, and we tacked on a void year. So that means, we saved $750,000 against the cap this year. We're really stringing along as much as possible. He is the leader in the clubhouse now for our right guard position. He played a number of different positions with the Dolphins, including like all over the line, including left tackle. Right guard was probably his best graded position while on that team. And he also started like every game for the past 4 years for the Dolphins. So he's a very durable player. That's probably a good thing. As a player, he is a higher performer than Oli Udoh has been when Udoh's been on the field. So it's positive competition there. Obviously, we've had very poor right guard play over the past 2 seasons, right? We went from Dakota Dozier, who was terrible, to Oli Udoh, who was bad, and Jesse Davis is probably poor, quote unquote, I would say, in terms of level of guard play. So we're making a slow increase, and we talk about this with offensive line a lot. It's really a weak link position. It's really a weak link unit where you're as good as your weakest link. So if we're improving our weakest link, which this Jesse Davis contract does do, assuming he plays like we think he can, by which I mean like better than Oli Udoh did last year, it does improve our offensive line in general, but it's not too much of a needle mover for me personally. Thoughts, Nick?
I would agree with that. I think on Jesse Davis, I was a little disappointed, I guess, just because I feel like there have been some better value signings at guard, and I think Davis is a backup caliber player. He's a high-end backup, like a versatile Swiss Army knife on the offensive line. He's played left tackle, left guard, but predominantly for the Dolphins, right guard and right tackle. But he can play, 4, probably even 5 positions. If you can play right guard, you can usually play center if you can snap. So, but he's not somebody I would like pen in with a starter. You could pencil him in right now. But Andrew Norwell got like 4.5 million or something. There's some other guys. Karras got like 5 or 6 million. Eric Flowers is still out there, and I wouldn't be shocked if he went for like $6 million or something on average. So I probably would have preferred to spend a little bit more. That said, I do approve the strategy of just not spending big on the guard position. It's not the position that'll win or lose you games. It's not worth going out there and signing Brandon Sheriff for $15 million, $20 million a year or whatever. So Jesse Davis, I think you're right. He does provide an upgrade over Oli Udoh, and so that at the very least is encouraging, or at least 2021 Oli Udoh. The thing I would say is that worst case scenario, Jesse Davis is our starting right guard, and he's graded out in like the 50s and 60s in his PFF grade. He's like been a below average, lower mediocre tier right guard. He's even worse at tackle, but if he's playing right guard and he doesn't have to worry about giving up the edge as much, he'll probably do a little bit better there. He's graded out a little bit better. I don't want to say always, because he's had bad games at both tackle and guard. He's graded a little bit better at right guard. Just to throw out PFF grades, because Game Pass doesn't let you look at like previous year's film anymore. It used to be.
Oh my god, it's an atrocity. It's an atrocity.
So that's my mea culpa for like not having done a significant Jesse Davis like tape talk deep dive, but like his PFF grades, which are PFF grades, I rag on PFF, but their offensive line grades are extremely stable year to year. So they do carry signal. It was 52.5 last year, 62.6 the year before, 58, 59 the years before. Oli Udoh, for reference, was 54 last year with a 39 pass block grade. The year before that, Dakota Dozier was a 44. Drew Samia was a 33. So, you're talking about like bad play, but somewhere between. I love again that the Vikings give us these gradations. Better than Oli Udoh or Dakota Dozier, probably a little bit worse than your Josh Kleins of the world. So somewhere in there is. But if that's your floor, like you can live with that. That's fine. He's a better pass protector also than like a run blocker as well. So that much is encouraging, because that's probably what people remember the most. And then Oli Udoh is still really young. He's this is his 5th year playing the position or something. So he's still very raw, could still develop into something. And they drafted that 3rd rounder last year. In Wyatt Davis, and if they have something in Wyatt Davis, if he comes and shows up to camp healthy, Wyatt Davis was drafted with the intention of being a starter, I think, in the shorter term. So, worst case scenario, you get a guy who's an upgrade over last year's Oli Udoh and a significant upgrade over Dozier. Best case scenario, Wyatt Davis wins the job, or Oli Udoh takes another monumental leap forward and they get like average or above average guard play. Not the worst position to be in, especially for a guy you signed for $3 million. And in that instance where he doesn't win the starting spot, then you got like a perfect swing tackle / backup guard. So I can see the logic why it worked out, even though it's probably in an ideal world not the guy I would have gone for. I mean, the Dolphins line has been so bad, so it's hard to get encouraged about the one of the few players signed from a line worse than the Vikings. So, but he's a fine player, and Vikings have given us plenty of experience with like actually bad guards and offensive linemen, and Jesse Davis is not bad. He's just normal bad. So.
Yeah. I'm confident that he is not going to be a complete disaster at the position, which says something for the Vikings, like, ultimately. Now, if he has to play left tackle, he's going to be a complete disaster. So that's one thing. But hopefully we don't get to that point. But no, I think your point is a really salient one of, he's kind of the floor, right? You expect him to come in, be a veteran presence, and provide you with a level of stability. If you have players in camp outperform him in Wyatt Davis or Oli Udoh, right, as they grow as professionals in the NFL, right? I mean, this will be Udoh's 3rd year? Maybe it's his 4th year, but he, like you said, he's a young player. And Wyatt Davis was really held back by a core injury or some sort of injury and just a slow start that he got off to his career last year as well. So if they're able to compete and come in there and beat him out, that's a good sign for them, because at least they're above his baseline, which, again, That's not like super high, but if they beat that out, you're probably getting average level right guard play, which is a vast improvement over what we've seen the past, 2 seasons. So, no, very, it's a signing. We did something to improve our depth there, and I think we can be happy with that at least. So Chandon Sullivan,
like it's bargain bin hunting, but like Laken Tomlinson went for what, like $10 million a year.
right?
I would much rather have Patrick Peterson and Jesse Davis and Chandon Sullivan for $10 million
And Za'Darius Smith,
yeah,
yeah,
Za'Darius Smith with $3 million. So Vikings, Kwesi's found a great job of stretching his cap dollars and getting the most bang for his buck with these guys. So, best case scenario, Jesse Davis is like the new Rashad Hill or something, guy who can kind of fill in and not be totally terrible. Worst case, he's our starting right guard and he's bad, but he's not Drew Samia levels bad, which is like, it's important to not be that like game-wreckingly bad. And Jesse Davis is not that bad. He's just a little bad.
No. And maybe we're sugarcoating this a little bit, right? Like, I think optimally, you probably, like you said a bit earlier, want to sign somebody like the Eric Flowers to the $5-6 million a year range at that position. And that might be the decision we should have made as opposed to Jesse Davis. But I don't think it's like egregiously bad. It's not something that's going to destroy our season. So it is what it is.
And Flowers was making over $10 million last year.
Right.
So I could just be completely off on his mark and he could get signed for, 8, 10, 9, what is that, 9 figures or what, 10 figures? So yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. So
no, absolutely. So let's move on here to Chandon Sullivan and maybe, let's go to Chandon Sullivan first. The former Green Bay Packers slot corner, we signed him to a 1-year, $1.75 million deal. Not a lot of money. It sounds like Za'Darius Smith had a hand in recruiting him over to the dark side, I guess, kind of, coming over to the Vikings from the Packers, or away from the dark side, really, in our eyes. But no, he was the Packers' starting slot corner, it's kind of weird for them because they use a ton of dime personnel, even post Mike Pettin, to where they have 4 corners on the field a lot. So, maybe he was like their 4th corner or like the corner they saw as 4th, but he was on the field a ton because they liked the role that he specifically played in those situations. But he's kind of a slot only guy, and he's not a great athlete. And that's probably the biggest concern with him, right? He's a cerebral guy who's good in zones, but he's not a great athlete. And I think the one thing that, and we touched on this a little bit in the Fangio defense, is they are more of a zone match defense than a man match defense, where the Zimmer Saban systems are like quote unquote man match systems where they play with heavier man principles or more direct man principles, and the Fangio system kind of plays really tight zones, which is functionally they're pretty similar, right? So it's kind of a small distinction to make. But if you're gonna, I guess, from a Chandon Sullivan perspective, the Fangio defense is more forgiving for guys who don't have that man corner athleticism or that man corner prowess, than the Zimmer Saban kind of tree of defenses is. So I think that is a little bit of a silver lining there in terms of like, he's a cerebral player who's going to pass off things well and read things correctly. You can certainly get matchups against him, right? So that's a concern. But he's a playable slot corner in the Vikings, and we keep talking about this. The Vikings didn't have playable players at the position, right? Our only playable corner before this past week was Cameron Dantzler, and he is not a slot guy, right? So you need the guy with that flexibility to play in there. I don't think Harrison Hand is going to be it, right? Like he would have been our option at slot corner, and that's what he kind of has experience with under Zimmer last year. But like, we needed somebody who could at least come in with a baseline level of maybe competence here. And slot corners, it's so weird to me in the NFL, like how important corners actually are to playing defense and how they refuse to pay slot corners like at money at all, right? So Chandon Sullivan not getting a lot of money, borderline starter money. You would hope that they bring in further competition in the slot for him, honestly, through the draft. Like, that's kind of my hope, is that you get a day 2 corner who kind of has the ability to play in the slot to compete with him. But he's somebody who I think you're not embarrassed when you trot him out there in the slot. And that says something for him, I guess.
Yeah, he's a really interesting player because I think sometimes you watch his tape and he gets put in situations where you're like, this isn't an NFL player. This guy shouldn't be out there. And, you know, he's young and he went undrafted. He's only 25. And I think there's a pretty clear reason why he went undrafted. He is not an athlete. Patrick Peterson is faster than Chandon Sullivan right now, despite being a decade older. So it just doesn't have a lot of long speed, which is concerning. Especially like on third downs, your nickel has to be able to like cover guys in man. You're going to get blitz calls on third down that are going to result in your cornerbacks having to carry guys in pure like cover 0 or cover 1 type man situations. So Chandon Sullivan gets exposed when he gave up a 78-yard touchdown to Van Jefferson against the Rams once, which it was a smart play called by the Rams that basically forced quarters coverage, but the safety basically wound up doubling Cup, and so Chandon Sullivan wound up basically cover 0, or just like pure man 1-on-1 versus Van Jefferson, and Jefferson got leverage and then just beat him vertically. But yeah, and Van Jefferson's not like a fast receiver either, so it worries you a little bit about the lack of long speed. But even more so, like for a nickel cornerback, his hips are so tight. It's unusual because usually nickels have to be very oily hipped. They have to be able on a swivel because they're always defending two-way goes. It's really interesting what the Packers did with him. They instead of doing that, they said, we're just going to open your hips pretty early. You establish the leverage right away. So you'll open your hips and we'll put the divider line such that like you always give up the inside release. And that way you can just sort of drive on anything they go inside, and you can body them, wall them off if they break out the other way, which is that's an interesting way to do it. He doesn't really have a good back pedal. He can't really speed turn or even like zone turn as much. So you describe him like this, and he sounds like, why would you even sign him to anything? But he's got great zone instincts. He's got great burst on the ball. For all I'm knocking him on his athleticism, his jump scores were actually like well above average. So he's explosive when he's clicking and closing on the ball. He's got great ball skills. He's got long arms, so he's really able to like get in there and like disrupt the catch point. He had 3 interceptions last year, which is not bad. And also he's 25 years old and has like over 2,000 snaps for Green Bay over the last 3 years. So you're talking about a guy who played like a starting caliber nickel. I just think he's very limited in the ways you can deploy him. It works well for a Fangio-style defense, which the Packers were last year, because when you have 2 safeties, those split safety coverages expose they're going to hide a little bit, I think, that lack of speed. They're going to be able to allow him to play as more of a pure zone player. Honestly, he looks more like a safety to me when I'm watching him. Like he's a safety who just plays as sort of the apex or the hook player or something. So you could even see him deployed as a safety. Wouldn't shock me if that's where he ultimately wound up, because he reminds me a little bit of Cam Bynum, like a guy who I don't think has the athleticism necessarily to play corner, but great zone instincts, good burst on the ball, does a lot of good things at the catch point. So. He's also a liability in run coverage for all the other criticisms I'm leveling at him. He's very passive. He kind of lets the ball carrier come to him. He doesn't I wouldn't go so far as to say he avoids contact, but he doesn't shoot gaps in the run game. He sort of waits until okay, yes, now I have to get in on this tackle, I suppose. So sometimes you see players just lower their shoulder and get right in there, and then you see other guys who sort of wait on the outside and just sort of give themselves a few minutes to be like, do I have to? So he's a liability in the run game, not very physical, and not NFL caliber athleticism. All that said, well, other than that, Mrs. Lincoln, Packers found a way to make him a starting caliber player, and I think he will continue to be a starting caliber player in the Vikings. Just an interesting guy. The way you have to scheme around his limitations. If you do, he can be a fine player, and I think he will be. So.
Yep, I like we're talking about. I don't think he's making any Pro Bowls anytime soon, right? But it's it's kind of at the Vikings defense, or the cornerback room specifically, was at a point where it's like you just have to not embarrass yourself next year with it. Kind of like I hit on earlier, where it was just devoid of any. It was literally there were 3 players in it. So with the lack of cap space that we had, you kind of needed to get creative. We did that with bringing Patrick Peterson back, and we did that with Chandon Sullivan. Like you said, experience in the system. Kind of fits with the system. His weaknesses are kind of covered up by what we can do in terms of the cover 4, the cover 6 that we're going to run here. So, no, totally agreed there. You know, not the best player in the world, a lot of limitations, some question marks, but you can put him out there on the field and you don't feel like you can sleep okay when you're putting him out there on the field, right? You're not going to sleep happy maybe, but it's all right. Like,
yeah, and honestly, like you look at his, I hate cornerback stats because they're all bad, but like you look at his like PFF grades, you look at his like even like the good stats, like targets allowed per coverage snap, or catches allowed per coverage snap, or even yards allowed per coverage snap. And he puts up pretty good numbers, and part of that is the scheme hiding him a little bit. And a lot of times when cornerbacks have those good stats, a lot of it is you can probably judge cornerbacks a lot more by what does their head coach ask them to do versus like how much do they hide them, because any quarterback can have good stats in cover 2. You just have to hide all their liabilities. So part of it is the Packers hiding his limitations, but at the same time, in the system he can be a fine player, and I think he will be for Donatell next year. I think he's your runaway favorite to be the starting nickel. And I don't think he's necessarily a liability there. I think the guys they've added really suggest to me that they're going to be a much less, like you said, with Zimmer it was a lot more man match. This is going to be more zone match, and even like spot drop zone I think we could see a fair amount of, because the emphasis really with Donatell's defense, and Donatell even separate from Fangio has always been about turnovers. And you get a lot more turnovers in zone coverage because you're watching the quarterback. You're able to bait throws. You're able to make plays on the ball when you're watching the ball as opposed to watching your guys. So Sullivan is a good zone player. So is Jordan Hicks. So is Patrick Peterson. Even though Pat Peterson used to be like a man guy, now he's probably a little bit better as a zone corner too. So all these guys they're adding, I wouldn't trust them to run cover 0, cover 1 with these guys, but for quarters or for cover 2 or the other flavors of zone coverage, I think they're all going to be pretty good. They're good communicators. I didn't mention that, but like Chandon Sullivan's an excellent communicator on the field as well. Really good passing off routes. He's very smart, very savvy. So you can take advantage of all that stuff by just throwing. I get the impression they're just going to be a much more zone-heavy defense, and maybe they're a little bit softer and give up a few more things, but I think that'll also probably result in more interceptions, more turnovers. So I think there's a method to all this madness, and these guys that they're adding who are they're finding guys, and maybe they're trying to find an edge at guys who. You can't run man coverage with them, so a lot of teams pass on them, but they're able to find sort of diamonds in the rough with the right scheme here.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So we covered Chandon Sullivan there. We also signed 2 more corners. One somewhat of a familiar face in Tye Smith, who was...
Bring them all in. Need as many as we can get.
Yeah, who was, on our practice squad at some point last year, definitely on the preseason roster, played a couple games in the preseason last year. And then we also brought in Nate Hairston, who was with the Broncos last year. He played about 15% of the snaps. It was about 150 snaps on defense, and then he also played a significant number of special team snaps. I believe over 200 special team snaps last year. So I think he's one of the guys we're kind of bringing in. Ed Donatell, worked with him last season as a core special teamer. He's been in the league about 5 years, and he does have that outside corner kind of size. He's 6 foot. I just pulled up his mock draftable chart, actually. He's pretty much like average across the board in terms of athletic testing and what he looks like for a corner profile. So, he's not some sort of special athlete or anything, but I think he'll mostly be a core special teamer and maybe depth that Donatell liked to bring over as somebody who he can continue to develop there. Tye Smith, I think, is like he was last year, a long shot to make the roster, but you need camp bodies too, right? So... neither of them move the needle much for me. I don't think they're starting players. I don't think there's somebody that we should pencil in as competition for starting players, but there are guys who are on the team now.
I mean, Hairston being like CB5 or CB4 for the
Yeah.
Broncos or whatever, like the Broncos had a lot of good corners. So if you're winning snaps on that team, like I'm fine with it. He's a vet minimum player, so I'm not too worked up
Yeah.
about it. But these are guys that round up the bottom of the roster. All the competition we can get, so that I don't have to worry about seeing Chris Boyd out there, is good for me.
Yes.
So.
Yes.
Not to pick on Chris Boyd actually had some good snaps last year in coverage, so I don't want to pick on him. Other than that extremely boneheaded, what was it, taunting penalty or
Yeah,
unnecessary roughness?
man, Chris Boyd is a fun special teams player too. Like the one game, I think it was against the Cowboys where he made like 3 mistakes in a row and it sucked. Like one, he got too excited, I think, because it was a fake play, it was a trick play or something. But he's a good special teamer. Like he's a pretty solid gunner. So it's not like I want Chris Boyd on the roster, and he's a great personality. It seems like in the locker room and all that. All the guys seem to love him. Like I want him on the roster. I just don't want him playing corner.
That's all.
Yeah. Unfortunately, it is what it is. So we've gone through all the signings, got you up to date on the Vikings news, and we figured it'd be a good time to go back and kind of reassess where the Vikings are at in terms of need post free agency. I think they did address the kind of needs that we hammered in our pre-free agency, right? We were hammering corner. We said we needed at least 2. We did sign 2. Maybe they're not quite the caliber of player to where you think that's totally resolved, but we signed 2. We said they needed an edge. We resoundingly solved that issue, I think, with Za'Darius Smith. I think that's probably that's our biggest free agency move, and it's probably our best free agency move, especially being able to get him on that deal. And we made a little bit of noise with the Jesse Davis signing on the interior offensive line. So we kind of discussed corner and offensive line as continued needs throughout this podcast, right? Where we want to see them add that in the draft. I think you can also throw depth or competition at safety in there, right? We mentioned Cam Bynum. We like Cam Bynum, but he's a second-year, 4th-round pick who's played like 2 games in his career, so I'm not 100% sold on him being great. I just want to see some competition there. What's your priority for the needs, Nick, and anything that I didn't mention that you're kind of interested in looking at?
If I think about this as who's the worst projected starter on the roster right now, it's probably Jesse Davis, I would say, now that they've added Pat Pete and Chandon Sullivan. You could probably make the argument that Chandon Sullivan is the worst starter. I probably would disagree. Jordan Hicks also is probably not. I mean, he's a solid starter. So any of those guys, you would want to replace when you start thinking about like, okay, not just this year, but also what's this roster going to look like in 2023? Maybe Patrick Peterson isn't back. Maybe Eric Kendricks, Jordan Hicks. You have to do succession planning, but I mean, there's a lot of spots you can do that. They got to figure out a plan from Adam Thielen, KJ Osborne. He's probably not the worst wide receiver too, so maybe wide receiver isn't the biggest need. But I mean, then there's the big giant glaring question mark at quarterback for what's the future of this team. Kirk Cousins is only extended 1 year, so if you are planning to move on from Kirk, like you got to find a quarterback as well. So I think they've positioned themselves well enough that they can pretend like they're going to go best player available in the draft. At the same point, I look at this cornerback room with Patrick Peterson at his age and Chandon Sullivan not entirely being a starting caliber player, and think like cornerback is probably where I would lean. Everything else equal. Like if I had my pick of any player in a similar tier, I'd probably pick a corner or an edge player or over defensive tackle or wide receiver or other positions. That said, their positional value also comes into play because like Jesse Davis is probably the worst starter on the roster. At the same time, I would rather spend a 1st-round pick on a cornerback than a guard because you can find good guards, even starting caliber guards later in the draft. The Chiefs found it, 2 interior offensive linemen just this past draft. So you can do that. That doesn't happen pretty much ever with cornerbacks. So I would rather use my premium picks on premium players. If there's a quarterback that they like, I would pull the trigger there too, just because I think we all know that something's probably got to give on this Kirk Cousins situation. Eventually, he's not going to be the starting quarterback for the Vikings. So, and more important to get that position right than anything else. I guess I would say Cornerback's still the number one need, especially considering, if they get somebody who can play nickel too, like that would, you get them to not just like 2023, but also this year for the nickel cornerback. Offensive lineman is up there, and then edge player is up there too, because Hunter and Za'Darius Smith are both, on the back end of their career, the back half of their career now, and they're both injury prone. Or I shouldn't say injury prone, but you can't depend on either of those guys to play every game for you going forward. So, I don't know. Those are the ones that jump out at me. But like I said, they've done a good enough job in free agency that they can go pretty much any direction, at least in the early rounds, and pick the best player available, I think.
Yeah, and we'll get into draft talk in a little bit, but I think I generally agree with you about particularly high value positions at 12, right? Because that's the main pick Vikings fans are looking at right now, is that number 12 pick. And to me, the answer has to be corner right now. I think if you look at Patrick Peterson's age, right, he's only on a 1-year deal. If you look at the level of play from Chandon Sullivan and Cameron Dantzler, I'm not totally sold on Cameron Dantzler as a pure starter, right? I don't know if he's somebody I want starting all 17 games as well.
Yeah, or even if you do like him as a starter, his nickname is literally the Needle. You cannot depend on a guy whose nickname is the Needle to start every single all 17 games. Like he's just so skinny. He's like very rail thin. He's not going to hold up for 17 games. So you gotta have your CB4s. You gotta have your Terrence Newmans or your Trey Waynes or whoever it is in there, because those guys will wind up playing 600, 700, 800 snaps. They're practically starters. So.
Yeah, you have to have some interchangeability there. And the other big thing I go back to with corner is if you look at the history of quality corners in the NFL, it is very rare to find great players or very good players outside of the first 2 rounds of the draft. Like, if you look at the starting corners in the NFL, and if you just take a list and list off the good ones, the vast majority of those guys were taken in the first 2 rounds. You can find, guards in the later rounds. That happens all the time, like constantly. You can find interior offensive linemen in those positions. Edge rusher is another one where it's almost exclusively the first couple rounds. Now, in recent years, actually, I think the later rounds have picked up. You look at Danielle Hunter, you look at Max Crosby, you look at Za'Darius Smith, you look at Matt Judon. Like, those are some names in the more recent years at edge rusher. But edge rusher is one you also need to address earlier. I wouldn't mind an edge rusher at that point. Interior offensive line, somebody we haven't mentioned is Garrett Bradbury. I think part of the reason we haven't mentioned is we both kind of like him more, I think, than the general Vikings fan does. But the other reason is the Vikings don't appear to be interested in moving on from him at all. Kevin O'Connell came out today, had some pretty nice things to say about Garrett Bradbury. It really makes me feel like he is their plan at center and they don't plan to replace him. Somebody like Tyler Linderbaum, who's been thrown around, is kind of probably not what they're going to look for there. Now, so, with that being said, safety too, also a need if a guy like Kyle Hamilton drops. That would be something that I'm interested in. So defensive back in general, I think, is where I'm looking at for the Vikings in the first round. On the offensive side of the ball, I think outside of that offensive line, we're relatively set. I don't think, a wide receiver is going to creep in there or something. And there's no tight end in this class that's worth looking at early on anyway. So it kind of is what it is.
Are there any positions you're just straight up writing off your board because even if they are like,
I've seen Jordan Davis mocked to us a ton. I hate that. Like, I like Jordan Davis as a player. I just don't think it makes sense to draft him after having Dalvin Tomlinson and Hairston Phillips on this team. Like, I don't think the positional value's there. I don't think that it makes sense with our roster construction to add him just because I think he's a little bit redundant with what we have. Now, to be fair to that line of thinking, Dalvin Tomlinson is only under contract for 1 more year, but I think we're still going to ask Dalvin Tomlinson to play 3-tech, honestly. And Jordan Davis is a nose tackle. Like, it sounds like we're going to ask Harrison Phillips to play nose. So we just signed Harrison Phillips to 3 years. Why are we spending a first-round pick on a guy who would literally replace his role, is kind of my thoughts on Jordan Davis. So that's the one I'd write off pretty much entirely.
I guess if you see, I think part of the problem with Jordan Davis is part of its projection. If you truly see him as a 2-down player, the value is never going to be there. If you see him less as a pure nose guard and more of a potential for a 3-down pass rusher, and part of the question is it conditioning? Is it he's elephant of a human being and he's never going to be able to play 1,000 snaps, or is it just Georgia's line was so deep that they could afford to rotate guys that heavily? Like, if he projects as like, a more athletic Vince Wilfork, I think you take that guy in the first round, or even like a Haloti Ngata, or
don't get me wrong. Like, I think for a lot of teams he makes sense, but just the Vikings with their needs and with like the situation they have on their roster, like the position I feel most secure about pretty much is defensive tackle, outside of maybe wide receiver, but I don't even think I feel offensive tackle. I was going to say I wouldn't take an offensive tackle. I wouldn't
take a tackle because Darrisaw was not like a Pro Bowler, but I'm encouraged by what I saw on tape that I think he's going to continue to improve. And O'Neal was a Pro Bowler last year, so I don't really feel the need to draft. Like, even if a top guy falls, I'm probably not drafting a tackle. So I could explain. I could see them talking themselves into a wide receiver. There's a few other positions. I wouldn't draft a running back. Even though Dalvin Cook is maybe on the back half of his career, and Alexander Madison, we're about to run out on his rookie contract. So there are some positions I'm willing to write. I probably would not draft, but it's just kind of interesting thinking about, like, we say best player available, but we're probably not drafting a left tackle, right? So
yeah, at the end of the day, if like and this is maybe getting into the weeds, but like if Ike Ekwonu falls to 12, I think I'm cool with drafting Ike Ekwonu at 12 and playing him at guard or something. And then if Darrisaw doesn't work out, then you have him as a left tackle or whatever. Because he's kind of profiled there. Or if Evan Neal falls to 12. Like, if one of those two guys who's like a blue chip top 5 prospect falls to 12, sure. But otherwise, if you have guys in a similar tier, and I think Jordan Davis is more in the where you see the top cornerback tier, or where you see maybe the top, there are like 4 or 5 edge rushers who are probably around that level. I'm taking the corner or the edge rusher over him based on the value, and I'm taking the corner or the edge rusher over a similar level tackle based on the positional need for the Vikings and what you project for the roster moving forward, I guess.
Yeah, I think if you were to script this draft, it would make too much sense for Derek Stingley to somehow fall to the number 12, and then number 7 from LSU is able to mentor the number 7 from LSU. It would be too movie perfect. So, and also the Vikings could really use a quarterback like Derek Stingley on the roster. So, I would be thrilled, especially they have his former DBs coach as their current CBs coach, Toronto Jones, on the roster. So, make a lot of sense, and I've seen him falling farther and farther with sort of Sauce Gardner shooting up the ranks, and some of the other guys, cornerbacks. People say, there might be 1 or 2 or more quarterbacks who go early, even though people were saying initially this was a weak draft. There's also a lot of been trades for teams who now need quarterbacks, like the Seahawks, the Lions, other teams in the top 10. So would be. I once thought like Stingley was the best player in this draft, so if he fell all the way to 12, that would be pretty amazing. So
yeah, absolutely. So I think we gave you a little bit of a draft preview there. We're going to get more in depth into the draft in coming episodes. Maybe we'll talk about corners next week. Let's see. We haven't really planned the next episode yet, but I think we did a good job here covering everything the Vikings have done in the past week, covering their signings. Any closing thoughts, Nick?
Yeah, I think this probably kind of wraps up free agency for the Vikings. I think they'll continue to probably be some depth signings, some guys close to vet minimum, but I think they've kind of spent their money. They've added starters at guard, nickel, and outside boundary corner. So I think those were the main needs. I don't expect them to do much else. It would be helpful if they signed like a bona fide cornerback for depth purposes. It would be nice to have more competition on the offensive line. But I kind of think they've spent their money. I would not maybe they like bring Sheldon Richardson back or something, but otherwise I'm not expecting them to spend big money going forward. So that's probably it for free agency. So going forward, Kindred Skull's probably going to shift a little bit more to draft talk. The draft is less than a month away at this point, so time to really start grinding that college tape and getting our thoughts on how we feel about each of these guys, what they're good at, what we're worried about as they project to the NFL. So
yeah,
this is Kindred Skulls. I am Nick Olson. You can find me at Nick Olson NFL. he is Matt Fries at Fries Football. You can follow us on Twitter at Kindred Skulls. Our co-host Greg Blake is at You've Been Gregged on Twitter and Instagram. He's attractive enough to have an Instagram to shout out. Unlike my ugly mug. I'm too unattractive, so I just stick to Twitter. So, and you can follow us on YouTube. Just search Kindred Skulls. You'll find our YouTube channel. If we're not too ugly to listen to, and you can stomach the non-pure audio.
Yeah,
format.
if our voices aren't ugly enough, you get to see our faces too there.
Give us 5-star reviews on iTunes. It warms the cockles of my heart every time I check it. And smash that subscribe button on YouTube if you're into that kind of thing, or even if you're not, please, it would make me happy, and it would make Greg and Matt happy too. So, with that, we'll sign off. Goodbye. We love you, Skull. Patrick Peterson's a Viking still, and that it makes us all very happy.
Yeah, Skull Vikings.
Do us any harm. Oh, another first round corner wouldn't do us any harm. Oh, another first round corner wouldn't do us any harm. And we'll all cheer on behind, and we'll score the old Vikings along. We'll score.